Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with New York City jazz pianist Faulkner Evans. During early April 2020, as the coronavirus lockdown was happening, he talked from the middle of New York about his 2020 CD called Marbles. He is originally from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and just happens to be a third cousin to iconic author William Faulkner. He grew up on classic 60s rock and R&B before getting hooked on jazz in high school, and he never looked back. He's got great stories. Dig it.
Hi, Joe. How are you?
Oh, we're hanging in there. How you holding up?
We're doing all right. It's the city's very quiet here right now, and as you can imagine. So everybody is seemingly adhering to all these restrictions and staying indoors.
Yeah. Where exactly are you located?
We're in the West Village.
Okay, I gotcha. Yeah, I can tell you from our perspective here, I've never seen it this thin being out in public. So I would presume that we are absolutely adhering to this. I think we all want this to be done as soon as possible.
I think that's the objective. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to New York City before, but I'm looking out our kitchen window here at 7th Avenue where it intersects with 10th Street and Christopher and Grove Street, and there's just nobody out there.
Yeah. It's weird, and I've heard stories about how New York at night is quiet except for sirens here and there, and it really kind of brings like a Gotham City thing to my brain. You know,
it's extremely quiet right now.
Yeah. Well, we just got to hang tough. One of the reasons why I'm doing these interviews is to kind of talk through the music and this extraordinary time for the human species. So thanks for taking a minute out today. I really appreciate it.
No, I'm glad to.
So let's start off with your latest CD, Marbles. Talk to me a little bit about this project and, how you feel about the artistic approach to it.
Well, I had done the last record, which was called The Point of the Moon, with a quintet, and that was the first recording that I had done with horns. And that was with Ron Horton, who played on marbles, and Greg Tardy on tenor saxophone. And I really liked that record, but when you think about it, two horns sounds like two horns, and three horns you can do so much more with orchestration. And so, my first objective was to put this together with the three horns, and I thought about Michael Blake and Ted Nash, both people who I've worked with, and Ron, who I've worked with a lot. And that's kind of the way it came about. And I decided that what I wanted to do was make this an all-original program. The last record that I did, The Point of the Moon, had a couple of standards on it. We did Alec Wilder's While We're Young. We did an Antonio Carlos Jobim tune, O Grande Amor. And I just wanted to make sure that this was all original, which it is, except for the very last tune, which is the Ellington thing. And, I started working on it, and Ron Horton and I started working on the arrangements together. And that's how it came about. And, I was just really pleased with the way things worked out and everything. And I can't say enough about these musicians. They're just top notch, and trying to put together rehearsal times was a real challenge because everybody's very busy. And so we had to do rehearsals with, three or four of us, and then three or four of us again. And we were finally able to put it together, and I'm very pleased with the way it came out.
Right on. So let me ask you this. Let's get back to the beginnings of your life. You're from Tulsa. Talk to me a little bit about your upbringing and how jazz became your life.
Well, I was born and raised in Tulsa. It was a great place to grow up. And I had a jazz group there as a quintet, and we used to play a lot in Tulsa. And there would be certain groups that would come through Tulsa, and they'd be on a sort of a tour swing, playing Dallas and Kansas City and places like that. And we would be their opening acts a lot of times. And we did Pat Metheny, who I think is from your area right there. And And we did Woody Shaw, we did Thad Jones and Mel Lewis, we did Stan Getz, and that group worked a lot. And but it was back when I was in high school that was the first time that I heard John Coltrane. And that immediately got me into jazz. I never thought I could be a jazz player, and at that time I wasn't, because I was still in high school. But I just loved the music so much. My father was a little bit of a jazz fan, and he would try and get me into things like Buddy Rich and Dave Brubeck and stuff like that. And I was more of a rock and roller then, but the first time I heard Coltrane, that just changed everything for me. So, I had this jazz group together, and we worked quite a bit, and that's the way that came about. And I'm very proud to be from Tulsa and everything. I've lived in New York for a long time now, and I'm very glad that I did the move.
So talk to me a little bit about coming from the Midwest and going to New York, and kind of what that period was like of getting your feet wet in New York and getting your career off and going.
Well, in 1980, I had an offer from the group Asleep at the Wheel to become their pianist, and I took that gig, and we would play up here probably 2 or 3 times a year. And I always loved New York. Just to backtrack a little bit, I came up here in 1975, 76, and 77 during the summer to take piano lessons. And I just fell in love with New York. I couldn't believe that you could go into these small clubs and see people you've been listening to for your whole life. And I studied, and the guy I was studying with was a gentleman named Dan Hurley, who's well known in the sort of jazz educational thing. And we would study, and then we'd go out at night and hit 2, sometimes 3 clubs. And that was a great experience. And so when I left Asleep at the Wheel in 84, I decided to move back to Tulsa, because I had basically been living a lot in Austin, Texas, where the group was based. And I went back to Tulsa, and I was trying to gig around, and the writing was on the wall, and I just had to leave. And I thought, if I'm not going to do this now, because I was much younger then I'm probably not going to do it later. And so I moved up here, and I got an apartment on 95th Street, a block from Spanish Harlem, and I was paying 4 or 5 times rent of what I was paying in Oklahoma, as you can imagine. And I started just gigging around town, playing a lot of solo gigs. At that time, there were so many piano gigs here. So, all you would have to do is just walk around a certain neighborhood and see a piano in a restaurant or something like that. And that's how I started here in New York, just playing solo work, playing restaurant works. I did a lot of the hotels. And I just sort of bided my time until I was ready to start recording and start, really getting out there and playing on the jazz scene. And, it's been quite a while now. I moved here in 85, and I'm, like I said earlier, I'm very glad that I did it. I met my wife up here, and we've been married now for quite a while, and it was a drastic change, as you can imagine. But I'm super, super glad that I did it.
So what was one of the first live jazz shows you ever saw where you thought, man, this is what I want to do with my life?
Gosh, let's see. In Tulsa, when we were doing a lot of opening acts and stuff like that, there was a lot of great groups coming through there. Woody Shaw had a great group at that time. But one thing that really did it for me was the first day I was in New York in 75 to study piano. And my piano teacher called me at the hotel that I was staying at on 42nd Street, very conveniently located, and he said that there was going to be a free concert. at this place called the New York Jazz Museum, which is no longer there now, by a singer named Betty Carter. And I had barely heard of Betty Carter. And so I told him, I said, look, I'm very tired. I just flew in this morning and all that. And he said, did you come here to sleep? I said, no. So we went to this show, and it was amazing. This was before Betty was a really big name. And she had started her record label, and the show was with John Hicks and Buster Williams. I forget who was on drums. And it blew my mind. It just blew me away, and we left that show, and I remember we're walking out of the New York Jazz Museum, and I thought to myself, I'm not in Tulsa anymore. And that was a really incredible gig for me to see. And that kind of did it for me. And that was my first day in New York. So that was a great gig, and I got to see Betty quite a few times since then. So I felt very fortunate about that.
Talk to me about mentors, teachers, anybody that really has taught you that has resonated throughout all these years.
Well, I would have to say that the number one person is the pianist Mike Longo, who we just lost a couple of weeks ago. When I first moved here, I studied with some really big names that I grew up listening to, and that was really exciting and a little bit nerve-wracking, too. And I'm not going to say who these people were, but one thing I found out after studying with these people was that just because somebody is a really great pianist, or musician for that matter, doesn't mean they can make you one. And teaching and playing are two different things. And I teach a little bit, but teaching and playing are two different things. So in '97, I went to Mike Longo, because a lot of other pianists highly recommended him, and he changed everything. I always thought I was a good player and everything, but I knew I was missing something. And so I started studying with him in '97, and I remember very well that I went to his apartment on 101st Street in Riverside Drive, and he sat me down and said, play something for me. And I played the Rodgers and Hart tune, My Romance. And he looked at me and said, man, that was great. He said, you can play. He said, I really enjoyed that. He said, give me 4 to 6 months, and I can straighten out your problems. And I stayed with him for 12 years. And he had a system that if you could learn it, then it was going to make you a better player. With the other people I was studying with, they would just put out a lead sheet for me and show me harmonies, but what I needed was a roadmap to be able to accomplish the same thing with any tune that I was trying to play. And Mike provided that, and he was a great guy. I don't know if you knew that he had passed away a couple of weeks ago.
I had a special segment specifically on him. He was kind of the first real name in the jazz world in accordance with COVID-19, so I gave him a very special shout-out.
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, he really deserved it, and I've been on the phone with his wife quite a few times, and it's still a shock, and we miss him. And so Mike was the number one person to really change things around for me, because he, just even in one lesson, he could figure out what was wrong and how I could become a better player. And that meant the world to me.
That's wonderful. So let me ask you this. If you have a dream tonight, you run into your younger self, say before coming to New York, and just really hungry and ready to go, what advice would you give your younger self?
That's a very good question. Coming from a situation of living in Tulsa to coming to New York, I wasn't prepared for how intense it could be. And so what I would say to anybody, myself, the younger self, I would come here and just start studying as much as you can and get to know as many musicians as you can, and play all the gigs that you can, no matter what they pay. And just try and work and work and work and persevere, and it'll work out for you. You know, there were times when I had my doubts that I was going to be able to make the rent, make the bills, and a lot of times I was working 6 nights a week. So it's something that's very different up here. I call it's like a level of involvement. How involved do you want to be? And if you want to be on a level to where you're recording, getting reviews, doing interviews like we're doing right now, and things like that, you have to be up here. You know, there's other places you can go, and I actually considered, the West Coast, but I always loved New York, and, I'm really pleased that I did this move. And we just, my wife and I, we love living here, and we're very lucky to live in the Village. And so, as far as any advice that I would give, I would just say, try and do it all. Study, go out and play as many gigs as you can, and don't, worry about the money, even though you have to make it.
Right on. So, why do you love jazz?
The freedom of it. I like to think of myself as a fine pianist, but a composer too. And I like the freedom. It's not just about the improvisation. I love that too, but I like a balance of that, and I hope that was conveyed in Marbles. We had great soloists on that record, and each tune could have been 15 minutes long, but I'm not interested in that. I'm more interested in the emotional impact of the music. I think sometimes we get caught up in, higher, faster, louder, and stuff like that. And, that's not what it's about. When I go to see people in clubs, we live 2 blocks from the Village Vanguard here, and, when people are walking out after a show, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about how much they loved the music, period. It's not about, dissecting it into this or that. And in the end, it's about the emotional impact, I think.
Oh, I agree totally. So, speaking of emotional impact, we're going to get to the point where we're going to get out of the COVID-19 quarantine, and we're going to be able to, the music's going to come back to life. What do you hope both musician and audience goer gets from this experience, maybe a revelation as they get back to it and get back to a live environment like regular life?
My biggest hope is that everybody goes out and supports the music. I think that goes without saying, and I think any musician would say that, because we don't know what we're facing when this is over. There's a lot of clubs out there right in the neighborhood that we live in that we don't know if they're going to be able to reopen. And one of the clubs is a club that I play at quite often called Smalls. I don't know if you've heard of that club, but and we had a CD release party scheduled for April 22nd, and everybody on the record was pretty much going to be able to make it. And I just hope that I think there's a lot of people who just would rather stay home, and I hope this shows people that when the clubs do open, that it's kind of like you don't know what you had until it's gone. And I hope that people get out there and support these places, because they're going to need all the support that they can get. There's obviously some clubs that are much better off than others, and there's no doubt that they're going to reopen. But there's some clubs that are just hanging by a thread, and it's a very tenuous situation. So I plan on, when the clubs do reopen, to go out as much as I can. I go out pretty often, and a lot of times it's just to support friends, but now it's going to be to support the clubs.
Yeah, I think that's very vital and important. I know in Kansas City we have a great scene. We got great clubs, and that's kind of the fear, I think, with musicians and just people that have any level of, even a moderate level of business acumen, you just got to understand that this is going to do something that I don't know that we even know the real outcome yet. But I guess the only thing we can do is be hopeful, that they do come back.
Yeah. Yeah, and you have some clubs there. You have the Blue Room. That's supposed to be a great place. I've never been there. I'd love to work there. And I know some other clubs, and I think Kansas City's a great place.
Yeah, it certainly is. So my final question to you is this. Everyone has a version or an interpretation of you. Your family, your friends, your fans, but you're living your life. Who do you think you are?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I like to think that I'm a very decent person who's trying his best to get my thing over, and that's what I was trying to do with this last record. It's interesting because I can't tell you how long it took to put this record together, as far as getting the music from the piano to sheet music to scheduling rehearsals and everything. And I think that everybody who played on this record was a wonderful person. And when we finished the record, the second day of the recording session, I was getting ready to leave. The photographer, Jimmy Katz, and his wife, Dina Katz, had done the photography there at the studio for the record session. And they had a rent-a-car, and we were getting ready to get in the car. And Michael Marciano, who was the engineer on the CD, he's engineered all my records. His assistant, Max, came out to the car, and he looked at me and he said, "Do you think you could have gotten some nicer guys?" So this was something that it was a joy to put together, because whenever we'd get together and rehearse, whether it was 3 of us or 4 of us or all 7 of us, it was just a joy to be together. I have so much respect for these guys. And Steve Nelson, the vibes player, who came in and did 3 tunes, I had seen him play with David Holland and with Rennie Rosnes, and I've seen him play at Smalls, and he was just amazing. I'm so glad I hired him. So it's as far as a self-portrait of me, I hope that I'm just a really decent person who's trying his best to play this music and master it and get it out there to as many people as I can.
Right on. That's a great way to wrap everything up. Faulkner, thank you for taking a minute out.
Okay, well, have a great day, Joe, and it was really my pleasure.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York City, Kansas City, and spots all over the globe. Where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Oklahoma, Kansas City, New York City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Faulkner for his time, music, and stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.